The murder weapon was never lost. That's what makes this case so strange. In most cold cases, the problem is that police don't have enough. A missing body, a vanished suspect, no evidence. But in the murder of Krystal Beslanowitch, the police had the weapon from the very beginning. It was sitting in an evidence room for 18 years. They could hold it in their hands. They just couldn't make it talk. The weapon was a rock, a large piece of granite, pulled from the bank of the Provo River in Utah, where a 17-year-old girl had been beaten to death with it in December of 1995. The killer had gripped that rock in his bare hand. He had left his skin cells on its surface. His DNA was right there, on the murder weapon, in police custody, the entire time. But a rough, porous granite rock is one of the hardest surfaces in the world to pull DNA from. Investigators tried. In the years after the murder, as DNA technology improved, they swabbed those rocks again and again, hoping to recover the killer's genetic profile. Every time, they got the same result. The victim's DNA, yes, and a faint, partial, useless trace of an unknown man. Never enough to build a profile, never enough to run against a database, never enough to name anyone. For 18 years, the answer sat in an evidence box. The killer's own DNA, on the murder weapon, in police possession, and no way to read it. The case went cold with the solution literally in the room. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. This is exactly what we do here. And then, in 2013, investigators tried something that hadn't existed in 1995. Not a new database, not genealogy, a machine, a forensic wet vacuum, brand new to crime scenes, designed to pull genetic material off surfaces that had defeated every swab. They ran it over those same 18-year-old rocks. And this time, it worked. It recovered a full DNA profile of the man who had held that rock. They ran the profile against the national database. It came back with a name, a man who had never in 18 years been a suspect, a man who had already killed once before. This is the story of Krystal Beslanowitch, the detective who carried her case for his entire career, and the machine that finally made a rock give up its secret. Before this becomes a story about forensic technology, it has to be a story about a 17-year-old girl, because that's what she was, and the way her life had gone made it far too easy for the world to look past her. Krystal Lynn Beslanowitch was born in June of 1978 and grew up in Spokane, Washington. By the accounts of the people who knew her early, she was a bright girl, someone who, at one point, dreamed of being a writer. But her childhood was hard. Her father died when she was very young, and as she moved into her teenage years, she fell in with a rough crowd, and her life began to spiral in the way that too many young lives do when there's no one able to catch them. Before long, she was being exploited through prostitution, a child, by any honest measure, caught in something no child should ever be caught in. She had run-ins with police as a juvenile. She had a child of her own at one point, a baby who was taken from her because of her drug use, a loss layered on top of every other loss. And in the summer of 1995, looking for the fresh start that people in her situation are always looking for and rarely given, Krystal and her boyfriend left Spokane and moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. It's worth stopping here because of how this kind of victim is usually treated. When a 17-year-old girl with a history of drugs and sex work turns up dead, there's a temptation, in the public, sometimes even in the system, to file it away as a lesser tragedy, to assume she put herself in harm's way, to move on quickly. Almost everyone in this story eventually did move on, except one man, a sheriff's deputy who was there the morning her body was found, who looked at what had been done to her, and who decided that a 17-year-old girl, whatever her life had been, deserved someone who would not stop. Her mother said something about Krystal that stays with you, that every time her daughter came home, she came in with her arms spread wide and a big smile, and that she never refused her and always loved her. That is who Krystal Beslanowitch was, not a lesser tragedy. A 17-year-old girl who was loved, who had dreamed of writing, and who deserved exactly the relentlessness that one Utah deputy was about to spend 18 years giving her. In December of 1995, Krystal was living in Salt Lake City with her boyfriend, in a motel not far from the streets where she was being exploited. On the night of December 14th, she left to walk a short distance to a nearby convenience store, a walk she'd made before in an area she knew. She never came back. Her boyfriend grew worried when she didn't return through the night. But, for reasons tied to the precarious lives they were living, he hesitated to call police right away. The next morning, December 15th, 1995, roughly 40 miles southeast of Salt Lake City, a rancher and his son were out near the Provo River, close to the mountain town of Midway, and there, on the bank of the river, they found her, the nude body of a young woman, lying face down in the rocks, bloody and broken. They called the sheriff immediately. Among the first officers to arrive at that riverbank in the cold morning hours was a young Wasatch County Sheriff's deputy named Todd Bonner. What he saw there would follow him for the rest of his career. Krystal had been beaten to death, her skull crushed with a large granite rock. Near her body, investigators found several bloodied rocks that they suspected were the murder weapon, and they had the presence of mind to collect and preserve them as evidence, along with scrapings from beneath Krystal's fingernails. There was also a small, chilling detail at the scene, a pair of socks, neatly folded, resting on a rock. At first, they didn't even know who she was. Her body went unidentified for a time, and the case was complicated by the fact that Krystal had sometimes used her stepsister Tracy's identity. It took real work just to give the victim back her own name, Krystal Lynn Beslanowitch, 17 years old, originally from Spokane. Now they had a name, a scene, and a murder weapon. What they did not have, what they would not have for 18 long years, was any way to connect that weapon to the man who had used it. The early investigation did what early investigations do. It looked hard at the people closest to Krystal. The first person to draw scrutiny was her boyfriend, Chris. There were reasons. He had been vague or misleading about Krystal's real identity, and when someone seems to be lying about one thing, investigators naturally wonder what else they're lying about. For a time, he sat at the top of the suspect list, but the more police looked, the less it held together. Krystal had been the one earning money. Chris was financially dependent on her, which undercut any obvious motive. And there was a practical problem that was hard to get around. Chris didn't even have a car. Krystal's body had been found some 40 miles away from where she was last seen. How does a man with no vehicle move a victim 40 miles into the mountains? Then came a second suspect, a local taxi driver named Herb Fry, who had become infatuated with Krystal. According to people who knew him, Fry had said something that put him squarely in investigators' sights, that if he couldn't have her, nobody could. It's the kind of statement that sounds like a confession waiting to happen. Fry became suspect number 2. But here is where this case is different from so many others. Investigators didn't just rely on suspicion, on motive, on the story that fit. They had physical evidence, and they used it. Over the years, as testing improved, they were able to pull a partial male DNA profile from the rocks around Krystal's body. And they compared it. It did not match Chris. It did not match Herb Fry, the two men the investigation had circled for years. The boyfriend and the obsessed taxi driver were both excluded by the DNA. That's a crucial thing to sit with. Without the physical evidence, this case might have ended very differently. A jury looking at Herb Fry's threat, or at Chris's inconsistencies, might have convicted the wrong man on nothing but suspicion. The DNA, even the partial, incomplete profile they had, protected two innocent men from being blamed. It just couldn't yet point to the guilty one. The killer's profile was there, on the rocks, but too partial, too degraded to name anyone, or to run meaningfully against a database. By the late 1990s, the leads were exhausted, 30-some people interviewed, polygraphs administered, every reasonable suspect run down and cleared. The case of Krystal Beslanowitch went cold. Cold cases have a way of scattering the people who worked them. Detectives retire, transfer, move on to the next emergency. Files go into storage. Most murders that go unsolved for 18 years do so because, at some point, everyone stops working them. That did not happen here, and the reason has a name: Todd Bonner. Bonner was the young deputy who had been dispatched to the Provo River that cold December morning in 1995, one of the first to see Krystal's body in the rocks. He served for a time as the lead investigator on her case, and when the case went cold, he did not let it go the way careers usually force you to let things go. He said, plainly, that it haunted him his entire career, that it was always in the back of his mind, that every time he and the other original investigators got together over the years, they talked about it. For 17 years, they talked about it. Bonner's career advanced. In 2009, he was elected sheriff of Wasatch County. He had every reason, at that point, to be consumed by the 1,000 responsibilities of running a department. But he kept checking in on Krystal's case. He kept it alive inside the system. In 2008, 2 full-time detectives were assigned to work it. More DNA was carefully extracted from the rocks as technology improved. The state crime lab and a private lab called Sorensen Forensics kept working the evidence. The case never fully died because Bonner would not let it, because he had decided, back on that riverbank, that a 17-year-old girl the world was inclined to forget was going to have at least one person who refused to. There is a version of this story where Todd Bonner retires with the case unsolved, carrying it as the great regret of a good career. That's how most of these stories actually end. What separates Krystal's case from the thousands that stay cold forever is not luck. It's that the right person refused to accept the wall and stayed close enough to the case that when the technology finally caught up, he was there to use it. And in 2013, the technology caught up. To understand what changed in 2013, you have to understand the specific reason this case had failed for 18 years. It wasn't a lack of evidence. It was the surface the evidence was on. DNA from touch, skin cells left behind when someone grips an object, is fragile and sparse to begin with. And the object here was granite. Rough, porous, irregular river rock. When you swab a surface like that, the cotton swab only makes contact with the high points. It can't reach down into the pores and crevices where cells settle. So the traditional swabbing method, used again and again on Krystal's rocks over the years, kept pulling up the same disappointing result. Enough to know an unknown man's DNA was there. Never enough to build a full profile. The tool that changed everything is called the M-Vac, and the simplest way to describe it is a sterile wet vacuum for DNA. Instead of dragging a dry swab across a surface, the M-Vac sprays a sterile collection solution onto the object while simultaneously vacuuming that liquid back up, pulling cellular material out of every pore and crevice the solution can reach. On a rough surface like granite, that difference is everything. A swab skims the top. The M-Vac floods and recovers the whole surface. In 2013, when investigators working Krystal's case learned about this new wet vacuum method, the decision to try it was, in the sheriff's words, an easy one. The swabs had already failed. There was nothing to lose. They took those same granite rocks, the ones that had been sitting in an evidence room for nearly 18 years, the ones every previous method had failed on, and they ran the M-Vac over them. The process of collecting the DNA from a single spot where the killer had touched the rock took a full day. But when it was done, the lab had something no one had been able to get in 18 years of trying. Not a partial, not a trace, a full DNA profile of the man who had gripped that rock and used it to end Krystal Beslanowicz's life. For the first time since 1995, they had the killer's complete genetic fingerprint. Now they just needed a name to match it to. With a full profile finally in hand, investigators did the thing they had never been able to do before. They uploaded it to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database, the system that holds the genetic profiles of people who've been arrested or convicted of qualifying crimes. In January of 2013, CODIS returned a hit. The name was Joseph Michael Simpson, and when investigators pulled his history, the story of this case snapped into a shape that was both an answer and an indictment of everything that had been missed. Because Joseph Simpson was not a stranger to the criminal justice system, he was already a convicted murderer. In 1987, Simpson had been convicted of a killing in Utah, the fatal stabbing of a man in Clearfield. He'd been sentenced to prison, and in April of 1995, he was released on parole. 8 months later, 8 months after a convicted killer walked out on parole, Krystal Beslanowitch was beaten to death on the bank of the Provo River. Simpson had been a shuttle bus driver for a Utah resort, which meant he knew the area around Midway, the mountain town where Krystal's body was found. Investigators believe he likely encountered her on the streets of Salt Lake City and that their paths crossed in the worst possible way. And here is the detail that shows why the M-Vac mattered so much. In 18 years of investigation, Joseph Simpson had never once been a suspect. His name had never come up. Sheriff Bonner said it directly. Simpson was never on their radar, not until a machine pulled his DNA off a rock. Think about what that means. All the suspicion that had landed on the boyfriend, on the taxi driver, all of it had been aimed in the wrong direction. The actual killer was a paroled murderer the investigation had never even looked at. No amount of traditional detective work had found him, because there was no thread connecting him to Krystal that a detective could follow. The only thing that connected Joseph Simpson to that riverbank was the DNA he'd left on a rock. And for 18 years that connection had been unreadable. Now it had a name. But a database hit, on its own, isn't proof enough for a courtroom. Investigators needed to confirm it, to get Simpson's DNA directly, and match it beyond any doubt. By 2013, Joseph Simpson was no longer in Utah. He was living in Sarasota County, Florida, with his mother, an unemployed man in his mid-40s, a long way from the Provo River, presumably believing that whatever he'd done in Utah 18 years earlier was buried for good. Todd Bonner was not going to let someone else make the arrest. This was his case, had been since he was a young deputy standing on that riverbank. So Bonner flew to Florida, coordinating with the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office to do this himself. They put Simpson under surveillance, and they waited for him to do what investigators in these cases always wait for, to discard a piece of himself in public, something they could legally collect and test. For 4 days they followed him. And on one of those days, Joseph Simpson flicked a cigarette butt onto the ground. That was it. That was what they needed. Investigators recovered the cigarette butt, and the DNA on it was tested against the profile the M-Vac had pulled from the rock. It was a match. The man who had smoked that cigarette in Florida in 2013 was the same man who had gripped the murder weapon on the Provo River in 1995. And then came the moment that 18 years had been building toward. When it was time to put the handcuffs on Joseph Michael Simpson, it was Todd Bonner, the deputy who had been first to Krystal's body, who had carried her case his entire career, who had refused to let it die, who did it personally. He told Simpson he was under arrest for the murder of Krystal Beslanowitch. 18 years after standing over her body in the rocks, Bonner got to say her name to the man who killed her. Simpson waived extradition and was brought back to Utah to stand trial. Joseph Simpson's trial took place in Utah's 4th District Court, and the defense did exactly what a competent defense does when the case against their client rests heavily on DNA. They attacked the DNA. Simpson's attorney made a real and specific argument. He pointed out that Krystal, tragically, had been a sex worker, and that as a result, DNA from more than one man had been found on and around her body. There was, the defense argued, a mixture of genetic material on those rocks, not just Simpson's. DNA, the defense insisted, is not the gold standard people think it is when what you're looking at is a mixture pointing in more than one direction. The jury, they argued, could not convict on the DNA alone. It was not a frivolous argument. Mixed DNA is a genuine complication, and juries are right to take it seriously. But the prosecution had an answer, and it was a strong one. Yes, trace evidence from other unknown individuals had turned up during the investigation. That was never hidden. But when it came to the full, complete DNA profile recovered from the spot on the rock where the killer had gripped it, only one person's DNA was there in force. Only one man was the major contributor to the DNA on the murder weapon. That man was Joseph Simpson. The jury also heard from Simpson himself, who took the stand and spoke about his difficult childhood, his depression, his chronic health problems, and asked them for some hope that he might one day see the outside of a prison again. On September 29, 2016, after deliberating for a matter of hours, the jury found Joseph Michael Simpson guilty of the aggravated murder of Krystal Beslanowitch. The following day, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was one more thing the jury learned only at sentencing, something they had been shielded from during the trial itself. Because it was so prejudicial, It could have overwhelmed their judgment. Joseph Simpson had done this before. The 1987 murder he'd served time for, the fatal stabbing, meant that Krystal was not his first victim. He had been on parole for one killing when he committed another. As one prosecutor put it, Simpson had stabbed a man and left him to die. And then, when he got out on parole, he took rocks to Krystal Beslanowitch's head until she was his second victim. Krystal Beslanowitch's case became something bigger than itself, a proof of concept that echoed far beyond one Utah riverbank. Before this case, the M-Vac was a promising but relatively unproven tool in criminal forensics. After it, the wet vacuum method had a landmark result to point to: a full DNA profile pulled from a rough granite rock that had sat in an evidence room for 18 years, defeating every swab, and that profile had led directly to a conviction. The president of the company that makes the M-Vac put it simply: getting DNA off a cigarette butt is impressive, but pulling a full profile off an 18-year-old rock is amazing. What Krystal's case demonstrated is the same lesson that runs through every episode of this channel, just arriving by a different road. The evidence was always there. The killer's DNA never left that rock. It sat in police custody for 18 years, complete and intact and unreadable. Not because the evidence was gone, but because the tool to read it hadn't been invented yet. The limit was never the crime. The limit was the technology. And technology moves. That should change how you think about the phrase cold case. A cold case is not necessarily a case with no evidence. Very often, it's a case where the evidence is sitting in a box, holding the answer, waiting for a method that doesn't exist yet. Somewhere in an evidence room right now, there are rough surfaces, degraded samples, and impossible smears that hold a killer's identity. And the only reason they're still unsolved is that the machine that will read them hasn't been built, or hasn't reached them yet. For the field, that's the takeaway. Preserve everything, because the future is coming for it. For the M-Vac specifically, Krystal's case was the moment it stopped being experimental and started being a standard weapon in the cold case arsenal, used in case after case since. Strip away the technology, and what this case is really about is who gets fought for. Krystal Beslanowitch was exactly the kind of victim the system is built to forget. 17 years old, yes, but a runaway, a drug user, a girl exploited through prostitution, someone with a juvenile record, killed far from home, unidentified at first, easy to file under the cold and quiet heading of a life that was already headed for a bad end. There is a grim, unspoken hierarchy in how murder victims get treated, and Krystal sat near the bottom of it. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for her case to simply fade. One more dead girl the world had already half abandoned before she died. It didn't fade for one reason. Todd Bonner decided her life was worth 18 years of his. He stood over her body as a young deputy and made a private commitment that outlasted his rank, his promotions, and every practical reason to let go. He kept the case alive through the dead years, the years when there was no new lead, no new technology, nothing to do but refuse to close the file. And because he kept it alive and stayed close to it, he was still there, still watching, when the M-Vac appeared and made the rocks readable at last. That's the human truth underneath the forensic one. The machine solved the case, but the machine only got the chance because a man refused to stop caring about a girl the rest of the world had written off. Take Bonner out of this story and the M-Vac never gets pointed at Krystal's rocks. The technology is necessary. It is not sufficient. Someone has to still be fighting when it arrives. Krystal's family got their answer. Her stepfather said what so many families in these cases say, that it took a long time, but he was glad they got him, and that the man deserved to sit in a cell for the rest of his life. It wasn't closure in any complete sense. Nothing brings back a 17-year-old, but it was justice, delivered to a girl the world had been all too ready to forget, by the one man who wouldn't. If there's a lesson in Krystal Beslanowitch's case, it's that the evidence is patient. It waits. For 18 years, the answer to this murder sat in a box, a handful of granite rocks with a killer's DNA locked in their pores, complete and unreadable. Every swab failed. Every suspect was the wrong one. The one man who did it was never even looked at. By every ordinary measure, This case was hopeless. And it wasn't hopeless at all. It was just early. The evidence was fine. The tool hadn't arrived yet. When the tool finally arrived, a sterile vacuum that could flood a rough surface and recover what no swab could reach, the case that had defeated everyone for 18 years fell apart in a single day of collection. A full profile, a database hit, a name that had been hiding in plain sight, a paroled killer no detective had ever suspected, and a cigarette butt, flicked onto the ground in Florida, that sealed it. Joseph Simpson thought a rough rock and 18 years were enough to keep his secret. He was wrong. You cannot wipe your DNA out of the pores of granite. You cannot outlast a detective who has decided you will not get away with it. And you cannot count on the technology staying where it was on the night you committed the crime. Krystal Beslanowitch was 17 years old. She had dreamed of being a writer, and her life had gone hard and fast in the wrong direction. And she was worth every bit of the 18 years one man spent making sure she got justice. It took a vacuum and a rock and a refusal to quit, but the man who killed her will die in prison, and her name is on the record as the reason he's there. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe these cases deserve to be told, subscribe. The next one is coming.